These protesters believe they are the defenders of democracy and freedom. Over the past decade, millions have joined the anti-globalization movement to prevent the spread of global capitalism.
We all want a better world, free from poverty and injustice. But good intentions don't make the world a better place. In this film, I am going to explain why I believe that the anti-globalization movement is ignorant and dangerously wrong.
The protesters claim that globalization creates poverty. They are wrong. All countries used to be poor. It's only in this new era of modernization that countries have started to escape destitution.
In the past 50 years, 3 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. This is historically unique.
Far from making the world a poorer and more unfair place, my research as a writer has convinced me that global capitalism could make the whole world as wealthy and free as Europe is today, if only we let it. In fact, poverty is on the way out in those countries that have integrated into the global economy. 150 years ago, my country, Sweden, was poorer than most African countries are today. And this bay was little more than a dump for Stockholm's excrement and garbage. But we embraced globalization, by which I mean a free market economy based on the right to start a business and trade without restriction. And just look at our wealth today. I'm setting out on a journey, first to Taiwan to see how globalization leads to wealth and democracy. Second, to Vietnam to find out what multinationals are really doing to developing countries. And finally to Kenya to try and discover why Africa is still so desperately poor. Far from being a threat to mankind, I'm going to show that global capitalism is its savior. Taipei, capital of Taiwan. Just 30 years ago, people in this tiny East Asian country were poorer than many Africans today. Malnutrition was widespread and there were no natural resources. Today, its people are as rich as the Spanish. Evidence of Taiwan's wealth is everywhere and rising. In the 10 years since they began modernizing, Taiwanese poverty rates were cut by more than half. Today, absolute poverty is virtually non-existent here, and real wages are 10 times higher than they were 40 years ago. This miracle only happened because the country consciously embraced global capitalism. But before a country can do that, it must have capitalism at home. And the first step towards that is land reform. If people don't own their land, they have no incentive to make it profitable. In the 1950s, the Taiwanese government began buying land from the old elite and giving it to the population. Yields increased rapidly, and Taiwan was supplied with food, releasing manpower for industry. Once, this was a farmhouse surrounded by rice paddies. It's where Mr. Wang once lived, and he still comes here to play mahjong with his friends. Mr. Wang illustrates how Taiwan benefited from land reform. His parents were poor farmers until the government gave them the land in 1968. Once he owned the land, Mr. Wang's father thought it worthwhile to build a mill. Today, Mr. Wang is a millionaire. He turned his father's mill into a factory, making those cheap plastic toys for which Taiwan became known in the 60s. His journey from rural beginnings to industrial wealth reflects how Taiwan has developed. At a nearby tea house, I asked Mr. Wang how it all began.
Toys, such as Barbie dolls, children's building bricks, sports gear like skateboards, stainless steel scissors with plastic handles. At the beginning, we were working 24 hours a day in shifts. The machinery in the past was more likely to cause accidents. You had to learn and absorb slowly. That's what caused the injuries to my fingers, because I didn't know better.
These early factories were sweatshops, but back then all Taiwan had to offer was cheap labor and long hours. Mr. Wang told me how the government's push for industrialization during the 60s meant his parents were encouraged to build their factory.
At that time, the then vice president was encouraging people to go into manufacturing industry by telling us, your home is a factory, the living room is a factory. Originally, we were growing crops. The field we were cultivating was given to my father by the government. The government was reforming at that time. They wanted to encourage small and medium enterprises. The government decided which land was for industrial use, which meant you could build a factory there. My father was given this opportunity, and so, of course, we made use of the land, and now our children are grown up and doing the same.
Mr. Wang's generation gave Taiwan sweatshops, churning out cheap goods for Western markets. Ugly blights on the landscape, yes, but don't oppose them. They were a transitory but crucial stage on Taiwan's road to riches.
If the anti-globalizers had been around when Taiwan industrialized, they would have protested against the factories and told us we were exploiting cheap labor. Surely they would have organized a boycott, and perhaps you would have decided not to buy things made in Taiwan. If enough of you had decided that, Taiwan would still be poor today.
As Mr. Wang and his generation became successful, more and more factories sprung up, which meant there was an increasing demand for labor. Once industrialization was well underway, competition for labor made wages rise, so only really competitive companies could survive. Companies like Acer flourished by responding to competition with innovation. Stan Shi, Acer's chief executive officer, is known for inventing Taiwan's first desktop calculator and the world's first pen watch. Today, Acer is the 7th largest IT provider in the world.
This is the first machine we export to the international market. So this is 1981. We train about 3,000 engineers in Taiwan based on this type of machine. So I'm so happy about that. This is really great. And this is the first computer in end of '83. We introduced one of the first compatible computer in the region.
Oh, and where was this exported?
Almost everywhere.
Mr. Shi invited me to join him at his lunchtime workout in the company gym. I wanted to know what he thought was the key to Taiwan's success.
Was it easier to start a business in Taiwan than in other countries?
Yeah, I think so. People, they really like to own their own business. So we have a joke in Taipei City, they say every 6 person in the street, there's one chairman.
But 1 in 6 persons you meet on the streets have a company. Is there less bureaucracy and restrictions than in other countries?
I think so. The government regulation, of course, is reasonable, and even many people start the business without knowing all the regulation.
A deregulated economy provides the ideal circumstances in which Acer continues to thrive and innovate, constantly improving people's living standards.
What will be the products of the future that you will produce?
We recognize today we have a lot of technology, but how to do more application, to package in a way it's easier to serve the more population, I think is our vision. And make IT like oxygen, okay? You don't feel it's existing, but it's so important to our daily life.
Across Taiwan, families reflect the country's progression. Grandparents were rural farmers, parents factory workers, and today's generation well-paid software engineers and businessmen. Fuji Chang works in IT in the capital and has a taste for expensive cars. Yet, like so many of his generation, his roots are far from the city. Together, we drove to Taichung, the town where he grew up.
My father was a factory worker. He worked much harder than us and was exhausted every day. He sweated while working and was always really tired. This is because our education levels are different. My brother and I had higher education, and I finished a master's degree. Our work is mainly office-bound, so our jobs are really different, as one is based on labor and the other on intellect. We used to be very poor, but now we are middle class, comfortably off. Most of my generation now works in the high-tech industry. This mirrors Taiwan's change in the last 20 to 30 years.
Fuji's mother still works in a factory. But for her generation, this was a step up from farming and meant parents could afford to educate their children properly. Rising prosperity also increases the returns on that education.
My parents were farmers. Back then, I really wanted to be educated. But when I finished primary school, my parents told me that I was the eldest, so I had to earn extra money for the family. I used to make shoes. I had to earn the money because I had 2 kids. Fuji and his younger brother needed to be educated. I'm very happy with what he has achieved so far. He's a good man, always striving to get ahead. He's very good to me. How can I put this? Well, he got married recently, and I went to Taipei City. His general manager and the deputy general manager told me that my son was brilliant. I was so happy to hear it that I cried.
The previous generation made the paper boxes. The current one produces the goods and software to put in them.
In contrast to African countries that tried to be self-sufficient and produce everything they needed at home, Taiwan specialized in those sectors where they could produce well and imported the rest. Because they were constantly exposed to foreign competition, companies had to be more productive and innovative in order to survive and grow.
From bicycles and toys to CDs and computers within one generation. I think that sums up Taiwan's story of from rags to riches.
Globalization makes a country wealthy, and it's this wealth which breeds a middle class with a vested interest in economic freedom and democracy. I believe democracy is another happy side effect of globalization. Today, Taiwan is a democracy, like Britain. Just 40 years ago, Taiwan was a dictatorship under the iron rule of Chiang Kai-shek. I visited his memorial with Yon Wang, writer-at-large for a business magazine, and a political activist who had taken part in the pro-democracy demonstrations right here.
After Chiang Kai-shek died in 1975, I think Taiwan has begun to go through a transformation. Because in the past, in the 60s and 70s, Taiwan relied very heavily on this labor-intensive industry. So in the 80s, we started to make computer parts, refrigerators, air conditioners, TV sets, things like that, more higher value added. The idea of a middle class started to become reality in the 80s. So together with the political movement, I think the middle class want to have more freedom, whether in their political rights or in their economic rights.
So would you say that globalization and economic development played a decisive role in the shift to democracy?
Yes, definitely.
Globalization and the economic growth that springs from it are the rocks on which democracies are founded. It's no coincidence that the richest countries in the world, like America and European nations, are the most stable democracies. Critics of globalization claim that this process of democratization is really Americanization. But if people in other cultures want to drink Starbucks or eat at McDonald's, why shouldn't they? Too often, we want cultures to remain frozen and intact so we can treat their countries like exotic museums, which we visit for pleasure. But shouldn't they have the same rights as we do? Besides, it's not as if McDonald's is ever the only choice. Taiwan got rich by rewarding those who used the best ideas and technologies from all around the world. And they still do. Just look at this place, Cha for tea. They borrow the latest Starbucks concepts to make their own national tea traditions popular and trendy. And they are expanding, with new tea rooms opening in the US and Japan. Globalization brings wealth and freedom to everyone. But the anti-globalization movement claims that it's only the dangerously powerful multinationals reaping the rewards.
You want to hear about sporting gear, then don't buy Nike. Nike always wants to take all the profits it can make. Shame Nike's ripping off their workers. Shame Nike's ripping off their workers.
A company like Nike is often branded the enemy of liberty and democracy. But it is in fact a huge contributor to wealth and freedom. Vietnam, till recently one of the world's poorest nations. The vast majority of the population still lives off the land. But that's changing. And it's changing because the country is full of those sweatshops that the anti-globalizers are so keen to boycott. We've arrived in the capital, Ho Chi Minh City, once Saigon, and we're on our way to visit the flagship factory of perhaps the most notorious of those multinationals. Say Nike to any anti-globalist, and they'll say sweatshop. Of course, I wouldn't want to work in one, but I've never said that globalization is a smooth ride. What globalization does is produce long-term benefits, which the protesters keep ignoring. And it's these sweatshops which are the stepping stones to progress. Sweden too had its fair share of them, as did Taiwan. They're a necessary stage in any country's industrialization. The factory's general manager, Lalit Monteiro, showed me around.
What many protesters forget is multinational companies are made up of people. And people take pride in working for a company and they want to do the right thing. One of Nike's maxims is do the right thing, and our employees take that very seriously. So when people protest the brand, we feel that there's a responsibility not only from an ethical standpoint to investigate whether there's truth behind allegations, but also because our brand is one of our greatest assets. For example, Nike as a rule does not employ any workers in any of our contract facilities under the age of 18 for footwear and 16 for apparel.
Vietnam outlawed child labor in 1988, But the economy was still weak, and parents relied on their children working in order to survive. But now the number of Vietnamese children in work has dropped by 2.2 million in just 10 years. People can now afford education, and more Vietnamese children are in school than ever before. The idea of multinationals hiring hordes of children to slave in their sweatshops is an outdated myth.
There's no incentive for a foreign invested company to hire child labor. First of all, it's not the right thing. But second of all, if a worker is found to have had a fake ID and snuck into a factory, we require the factory to pay for the worker to complete school and to continue paying them their wage. The average age in our contract partner factories is about 24 to 25 years old.
But I assume that they work here for a very low pay. Isn't this a way of exploiting cheap labor in a poor country, as many critics would say?
The average pay here is $54 a month, which compares to a local minimum wage of $18 or $19 a month for a state-owned enterprise. In addition, if you compare the wages to that of a doctor or teacher, they're not very far off. Many of these workers, they've come from an agricultural-based economy. They've had a chance, instead of working 10 or 14 hours a day in a field, to work in an environment that's clean, that's safe, that pays them a regular wage, where they get free or subsidized meals, and where basically there's an investment in their future training and education.
But Nike doesn't pay its workers more simply because it's generous, but because a multinational brings foreign machinery, new management ideas, a bigger market and education for its workers. These assets are what make a multinational so productive and so able to pay higher wages. In the canteen, I talked to some of the workers during their lunch break.
I was planning to go to Korea, so I had a break. After 2 years, I decided to come back to the factory because the company was good and produced good, high quality. The management was also very good, so I decided to stay.
I was a taxi driver, but after a while, business wasn't good, so I decided to come back and work here. My wife works in the cutting department, and her salary is higher than mine.
In fact, Sichi is paid 3 times more than her husband because she's risen to management level. Later, I visited Sichi at home.
I am the manager of the cutting department, and my job is to supervise the cutting in order to meet our high quality standards in making shoes. And I manage workers and make sure they arrive at work on time. My life has really changed because I don't work on the farm anymore. Since I joined the company, my life has become much better. Before on the farm, perhaps $500,000 was the most I could earn a month. Now I earn about $2.25 million, and life is much better now. There's my bedroom. I've just bought the TV.
At over £100 a month, Sichi's salary is now over 5 times what it was, and she has used the extra money to build an extension.
I'm trying to save money to decorate and make the place prettier.
I asked her what hopes she had for her son's future.
I want to bring my son up so he becomes a doctor.
The anti-globalists urge us to boycott Nike. If enough of you do that, Sichi loses her job. Watching workers playing sport during their lunch break, it was hard to see what the anti-globalists were so stressed out about.
When I go out into the local community, I get asked 2 questions. One is, when are you going to expand so you can provide more jobs? And 2 is, can you provide my relative or friend a job in one of your factories? There's a very high demand for these jobs in Vietnam. And what we're seeing now is workers from other parts of the country starting to migrate down to the south, looking for jobs like this.
I wasn't the only one touring the factory. While I was talking to Lalit, Mr. Kiet, the owner of a smaller local sweatshop, was also visiting. Doris Bungag, Customs Relations Manager, was showing him around.
This is a mini park. We constructed it for our workers.
This is not for reservation for the new expansion?
No. That's really designed for our workers to stay and relax during their break. This is a part of our expressing our gratitude to our workers.
One of the other things we've tried to do is really open up to outside visitors and have them make up their own minds about what we've been doing. Last year, Vietnam had over 1,000 external visitors to our contract factories. And these included college students, diplomats, non-governmental organizations, other businesses. So we have a whole plethora of people coming through all our factories, trying to understand what we do, trying to learn from us, and trying to understand the challenges we face as a global brand.
So, Mr. Kip, this is our innovation class.
Yes.
It's off-the-job training for Vietnamese middle managers.
Yes. And how long for one training course?
One training course is 3 months.
I see.
Yeah, 3 months course.
I see.
Later, I caught up with Mr. Kiet. His factory also makes shoes for export, and I was curious to know what he'd made of his visit to Nike.
Before I visit some foreign factory, especially Nike, we have a question. Why the foreign factory here, they work well and they can export much more, and anyhow they are better, why they're better than us? And after I visit Nike, and I know the answer. Management from Nike factory, they know how to make the worker happy. And I recognize that the productivity not only come from the machinery, but also come from the satisfaction from the worker. So I mean, for the future factory, one of the points we should concentrate is our working condition. So you see, this is the land is ready for construction.
Mr. Kiet had already begun building a new factory. The competition for labor that drives up wages and conditions is already starting here in Vietnam. Local factories don't go bust when a multinational moves in, as the anti-globalists fear. They improve and grow, thus stimulating the economy. And Nike benefits the community in other ways. Just a couple of years ago, the road outside the Nike factory was empty.
Just look at all this commerce close to the factory. All of this used to be rice farms.
Nike also gives microloans to local people wanting to start up small businesses. I went to see Chi Yen and her mother, Chi Han. With a Nike loan, they had started a business making rice paper. It's now thriving. Because of the protesters, it's probably the case that Nike is more careful than most multinationals. But on average, American multinationals pay 8 times more than the average income in the least developed countries.
Some critics would say that, yes, perhaps the presence of Nike here and foreign investments can create an economic development in this short run, but then wages will increase and reach that point that business will leave and go to another country with lower wages, such as China. And what is going to happen to Vietnam then?
I would challenge those critics on a couple of points. One is Nike has been in countries like Thailand and Indonesia for over 20 years. The wages in those countries, in Thailand for instance, the wage is almost double what it is in Vietnam. Now what happens is, as you stay in the country longer, your productivity increases. And you find out that workers produce more even as their wages go up. We expect the same to occur in Vietnam. We expect wages will go up. We also expect to be here for a long time.
Actually, if Nike does move on because wages have gone up, it's a great thing for Vietnam, because Nike will have played its part in developing the Vietnamese economy.
The anti-globalists have scary visions of vast multinationals ruling the world regardless of what people think or want. But big is beautiful. What we have to fear is not size, but monopoly.
What's happened in the age of globalization is that multinationals have got less powerful because free trade has meant they can no longer be in cahoots with the government. They have to be exposed to competition. Today, the consumers control the corporations. And it's those hated multinational corporations and sweatshops that are helping Vietnam to become rich. In just 15 years, the Vietnamese economy has doubled, and the amount of people living in absolute poverty has halved. In fact, poverty thrives in precisely those countries that fail to embrace globalization. Kenya, East Africa. Just 50 years ago, Taiwan was as poor as Kenya, but the Taiwanese are now 20 times richer, whereas 1 in 3 people here still lives in absolute poverty. People here are poor because Kenya closed its doors to globalization. More than half of the Kenyan population works on the land. Most farmers are still poor because the Kenyan government has never given them property rights. Whereas in Taiwan, giving people their own land was the first step on the road to industrialization and growth. Here, farmers like Simon Wamwaki can't even hope to expand. Simon is not even allowed to build on his land, and anyway it would be pointless to make the investment, as without ownership he wouldn't be able to reap the rewards.
This land still belongs to the government. I'm farming it at only for a short time. Even if we are cultivating the land still belongs to the government. So we do it like as if we are moving. Just we fight for survival for today and tomorrow.
So you will never get the property right?
You will never get the property rights, never.
How do you think agriculture would change in Kenya if all of you got property rights?
If we are allowed to do so, Kenya will be a very bright, very prosperous country.
But Kenya is not prosperous, hampered by bureaucracy at home and export restrictions abroad. Kibera is a shanty town clinging to the edge of the capital, Nairobi. Here, nearly 1 million people are crammed together without running water, sanitation or electricity. There are plenty of entrepreneurs here, but for all their hard work, people are poor. So why can't their businesses thrive? Yet again, it's about land. No one owns their plot.
What do you think would change in your life if you had a property right to this shop and to the land?
If I can get capital, enough capital, and start a business like the other one, I can make it.
Could you get help from
You can't get help from nowhere. It will be a problem.
If you don't own your land, you can't expand or secure a loan. On top of that, traders here have to buy a license. According to the World Bank, it takes 11 procedures, 68 days and half a year's income to get one. It's no wonder that half of all Kenyans work on the black market. What the people here demonstrate is that Kenya can't grow. Given the barriers they face, none of them can build their businesses, so capitalism can't take root.
If you have no money, the government won't give you a license. You have to give them money and then they give you a license. But the money is needed to build things like a roof over my head and other things. Everything depends on money. If I obtained a license, I could build, I could buy boxes. Do you see this dust? If I had boxes, I could sell samosas from now till night.
You can't get money to start a business like this if you have no means. It's hard to get machines like this if you have no money. If I had money to start a business, I would open my own barber shop.
Is the problem here lack of access to clean water? No. Is it starvation? No. Is it laziness? Definitely not. No, it's poverty due to lack of growth, due to lack of reform.
Everything else is just a symptom of that. In fact, even the biggest horrors, famine and war, have political causes. No democracy has ever been afflicted by a famine, and no two democracies have ever made war on each other. Africa has been subjected by socialism, gangster rule and protectionism. Africa has not been too globalized, it has been too marginalized.
Oppressive and corrupt politicians have systematically shattered Kenya's potential. But there are signs of change. In December 2002, a new president was elected, ousting the notoriously corrupt regime of President Daniel Arap Moi. The new government is breeding new hope, and the mood in the country is buoyant. June Aranya, a 21-year-old economics student, is passionate and idealistic about her country's potential to grow.
The kind of Kenya I'd like to see is a Kenya where people's ideas could be turned into reality, where ideas would be given the opportunity to compete, so that all the talent we'd have doesn't go to the grave. A Kenya where all the other ideas out there that everybody has access to are allowed here. A Kenya where if you're Bill Gates and Windows is in your mind, you can become a billionaire.
This is an outdoor market on the outskirts of Nairobi, known as the Jua Kali, Swahili for under the fierce sun. All kinds of goods, from pots and pans to hubcaps, trunks and toys, are conjured out of scrap metal. People here are clearly talented and as motivated and hardworking as the Taiwanese or Vietnamese. But what multinational would want to set up shop and hire these people in such a hostile business environment? These businesses are doomed to remain informal and small scale. For now, June's dream for Kenya remains an elusive utopia. But it needn't be like this. When the government relaxed restrictions on the mobile phone industry, sales soared, and now cheap mobiles have revolutionized the lives of thousands of Kenyans. The mobile phone industry is booming, and many Kenyans who can't afford expensive state-controlled landlines now own mobiles.
My grandfather, we could only visit him once a year before because he lives very far away, and my mother had to save the whole year to be able to ferry the whole family to see him, and he's very sickly. But since the coming of mobile phones, she could buy a phone very cheaply, give it to him, and now we can call him anytime.
June took me to a vast second-hand clothes market in Nairobi. People here sell cheap clothes imported in bulk from abroad. Like the mobile phone industry, its exposure to globalization has made this market a massive success.
We could overnight not tell the difference on the street between a rich person and a poor person because it was so obvious before. When I grew up, people had mostly 4 outfits: their Sunday best, which they would wear to church, their school uniform, and then 2 other outfits that they would wear at home. But since the coming of these clothes, you know, I can change my clothes as many times as I want, get them in the different colors I want.
Stephen is typical of a stallholder who has profited from this booming new market.
You guys are second hand.
The second-hand clothes business has helped me a lot. If I hadn't had this business, I wouldn't have had any other way of earning because I have no education. So it's helped me a lot to have a good life for me and my family with our 4 children. We've been able to build a fine house and I have a life that suits me. If it weren't for this, I'd probably be a laborer.
A few years ago, the government introduced a tax on the clothes, and recently they have raised that tax considerably. So import duties are yet again keeping globalization at bay and threatening one of Kenya's few success stories.
He said that if this industry was closed, he knows for sure there'll be lots of children walking naked. He says he knows many women who have up to 10 children, and these are the only clothes they've ever worn.
Even if Kenya did away with all its restrictions at home, there remains another vast barrier standing between it and the prosperity that globalization could bring. Wealthy countries have imposed high tariffs on almost all the agricultural products Kenya could export to them, with the exception of some vegetables and flowers. In the case of flowers, the European Union agreed to keep tariffs on Kenya's flower exports low. The result? Kenya has become the leading exporter of cut flowers to Europe.
Currently we are selling to the European Union mostly, that is in Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK also. We also sell to the United Emirates and also to the Americas.
Jane is the export manager here. I asked her what would happen if the European Union stopped giving the flower industry specially low tariffs.
That means that the farms would all perish. I mean, it's a disaster to the industry because right now the margins that we are having are very small, and whatever we are enjoying right now is because of the duty that has been reduced for us. That means if you put the duty, that the farms will certainly not operate, will all close down, and the social impact on that is terrible.
The European Union has reduced tariffs on flowers. What would happen if they reduced and abolished the tariffs for all other goods and allowed all of them into the European market?
Then the economy in Kenya would do so well.
But Kenya isn't doing well, despite these isolated success stories. And I believe that's partly because what we are currently doing is even worse than just trying to keep Kenyan agricultural exports out. The European Union protects our farmers by subsidizing food for export to countries like Kenya. The result? Formerly thriving commercial farms like Peter Mwangi's are suffering. In fact, over the last few years, Peter has had to stop cultivating large parts of his land.
Some people in Europe, they think that they are actually helping a country such as Kenya when the taxpayers are subsidizing wheat and so on. What would you say to them?
Oh, they are not helping Kenyans because they bring wheat when we don't need it. When they should bring when we ask them to bring, maybe when we have drought. Maybe they could be taken to a country like Ethiopia or Somalia where they don't grow wheat. But when we need it at the right time, they can bring, but not when we are harvesting or when we have a bumper crop. But how do you imagine I'm having a crop, someone brings another crop from outside the country, dumped it here, and I want to harvest. My wheat is not bought. It's not fair at all.
So the EU subsidizes our food exports, and hard-working farmers like Peter suffer. And then, when there's a food shortage a few years down the line, we send more wheat as food aid. Kenyans are good at farming, both crops and livestock. They don't need aid. They need the chance to compete.
When rich countries drop their protectionism, profits can soar. Yet the EU is often unwilling to open its doors to foreign competition. With tariffs, we keep their goods out. With subsidies, we destroy their markets here. We spend half of the entire EU budget on our farmers, the common agricultural policy.
We spend so much on farming that each of our 20 million cows could fly around the world once every year. How can Kenyan dairy or beef farmers possibly compete with that?
But if we allowed Kenya to export them, and if Kenya did away with its restrictions and red tape, Kenya could seriously compete with us.
It's not that we in the West are trying to trick poor countries into global capitalism. The problem is we are shutting them out from it. The two areas where the poorest countries could compete most strongly and so become rich are farming and textiles. But these are precisely the goods in which rich countries refuse to trade freely. The European Union, for example, has 10,794 tariffs, quotas and subsidies to protect our farmers and manufacturers. Imagine the amount of bureaucracy dealing with all that paperwork.
Once upon a time, we escaped poverty because we globalized. We produced and traded freely. Now that we are rich, we are withholding those same opportunities from poor countries.
If we dropped our subsidies and tariffs, we could massively reduce poverty in Africa. The United Nations has calculated that if we did this, developing countries could make as much as £450 billion a year from exports. That's 14 times more than they receive in aid today.
Our world isn't at all too globalized. In fact, it has far too little globalization. Wherever the doors have been opened, we have seen amazing results. Therefore, one of the worst enemies of the poor today is the anti-globalization movement. They are encouraging the EU and the US to have more, not less restrictions. These people are wrong and dangerous.
At the present time, the world's wealthiest countries are trying to agree to reduce protectionism. If this happens, it'll make it much easier for poor countries to trade their way to prosperity. But the anti-globalization protesters, however well-intentioned, have given our governments an excuse to back away from these reforms. So today, we all face a choice. Do we lobby our governments against globalization? Or do we campaign against the barriers to globalization that still exist? World poverty is not inevitable. Global capitalism can end that poverty. It has done so wherever it's been given a chance, in Europe, North America, East Asia. The issue at stake in the globalization debate is whether the world's excluded are going to get that same chance.